Felix Ofosu Kwakye.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for giving me the opportunity to contribute to the debate on the message delivered by the President of the Republic of Ghana, His Excellency President John Dramani Mahama, to this House. Mr. Speaker, I have listened in dismay at how our colleagues on the minority bench have attempted to create the impression that the President veered off the requirements of the 1992 Constitution in the delivery of his address to this House. Mr. Speaker, Article 67 of the Constitution is quite clear that the President is to deliver a message on the state of the nation before this House. So if any president came here and focused his entire attention on telling us what the state of the nation is, without going into what plans he has to address whatever problems he has encountered, Mr. Speaker, he will be well within his rights to do so. But right at the outset, President Mahama made it clear that he was not here merely to give an account on the state of the nation, but he was here to tell us exactly what he was going to do to get us out of the abysmal depths into which the Akufo-Addo Bawumia government sank this nation. And Mr. Speaker, he inspired hope in the generality of the people of Ghana. I have also listened with considerable shock as our colleagues on the other side have insisted that the economy that they bequeathed to President Mahama and his government was anything to write home about. Mr. Speaker, during our days in secondary school, we read the books of the Venerable Professor Na Afale Sakifio, who wrote in one of his books that the lizard says it is not as indignant at the boy who threw a stone at it than at the one who lauded the boy for having a good aim. It is bad enough that they bequeathed the country to the Mahama administration in the state that they did. But it is completely unacceptable and constitutes an insult to the people of Ghana to tell them that the terrible economy that they left is better than the one that they inherited. Mr. Speaker, fortunately, economic analysis is not done in a state of vacuum. Ghanaians have lived through the worst economic crisis in a generation. Ghanaians have lived through the worst economic crisis under the Fourth Republic, if not in the entire history of Ghana. Mr. Speaker, since the year 2020, or immediately after the elections of that year, the Ghanaian economy has been in a tailspin. For the first time in decades, a Ghanaian government defaulted on debt payment. And Mr. Speaker, there is no better measure of the collapse of an economy than the failure of a government to meet its debt obligations. When President Mahama was leaving power in January 2017, Ghana could fulfill its debt obligations. Mr. Speaker, our colleagues on the other side say that the economic indices they left were better than the ones that they inherited. Mr. Speaker, that cannot be true. Mr. Speaker, when the NDC was leaving power in 2017, our debt to GDP ratio, which is a theoretical measure of whether or not you can offset your debt in one bullet payment to the size of your GDP, showed that we could do that with barely half of our GDP. and still almost have to spare on other things. At a point, our debt to GDP ratio under the NPP leapfrogged to 104%. It meant that if theoretically we were to pick all of our GDP and pay our debt with it, we will still require another 4% to do so. It is the worst in our history under the Fourth Republic. Mr. Speaker, the budget deficit is the greatest indicator of economic prudence, because the fundamental principle of economic management is that you cannot live beyond your means. Even in our own lives, if you spend far more than you earn, you would always end up in difficulty. Mr. Speaker, when we were leaving power in 2017, our budget deficit, which essentially measures the difference between your revenue and expenditure, was 6.1%. Mr. Speaker, since the year 2020, up until 2023, every single year under the NPP, they left double-digit deficits. Mr. Speaker, if you look at the exchange rates, in the year 2016, the Ghanaian cedi lost 9% of its value in the entire year. Mr. Speaker, last year, the cedi lost 19% of its value. The year before, it lost 24% of its value. The year before that, it lost 54% of its value. Mr. Speaker, our colleagues claim that they have left a healthy primary balance. Mr. Speaker, the primary balance is simply the difference between your revenue and expenditure minus interest payments, because that is almost statutory. You can't do anything about it. Mr. Speaker, they programmed a surplus or a primary balance of positive 0.5%. Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that on commitment basis, they have missed that target by 800% margin. And the day that the finance minister comes to this house to read the budget, he will bear it all. You cannot have that kind of primary balance and insist that your economy is healthy. Mr. Speaker, look at our public debt. They inherited a public debt of 120 billion Ghana cedis. And I remember distinctly that President Akufo-Addo stood to your right in this house and declared that the 120 billion Ghana cedi debt was unheard of. At the last reckoning, Mr. Speaker, our public debt stood at 721 billion Ghana cedis. Even then, Mr. Speaker, it was because they denied 1.3 million Ghanaian bondholders of the rights to earnings on their bonds. Mr. Speaker, the domestic debt exchange program, as Mr. President rightly noted, is the harshest economic policy in the history of Ghana. 240 billion Ghana cedis, which was due 1.3 million bondholders, were withheld. They were told that contrary to the agreement they reached with the government of Ghana, that they were going to be paid a certain interest rate, it was going to be reduced drastically. The maturity periods too were going to be extended. Even pensioners were not spared the ordeal. So for the first time in our history, our aged pensioners had to picket at the Ministry of Finance on a daily basis in demand of what was due them. Mr. Speaker, these indices point to one fact, that the Akufo-Addo-Bawumia administration have been the worst managers of our economy by far and away. And there can be no dispute about it. Mr. Speaker, our colleagues on the other side also ask that how is President Mahama going to finance his well-thought-through proposals on economic recovery? Mr. Speaker, let me address that. Mr. Speaker, in the last 6 weeks alone, 52 billion Ghana cedis of the debt that they bequeathed has been due for payment. So the finance minister has done what every finance minister has done, which is perfectly legitimate, rolling over the maturities. That is what has happened. That is the reason why if you pick Ghana's debt today, it has not increased by 67 billion. Mr. Speaker, but I was coming to what President Mahama intends to do to make savings that can be channeled into other areas of expenditure. Mr. Speaker, President Mahama made it clear during the campaign, and indeed, Ghanaians had urged upon the political class the need to reduce the size of government. So President Mahama stated boldly that in the event that he was elected, he will work with 60 ministers. This compelled our colleagues on the other side to immediately promise to work with 50 ministers. Mr. Speaker, these are the same people who defended to the hilt the appointment of 125 ministers. Mr. Speaker, it will interest you to note that the worst economic outcomes that this country has seen emanated from their performance between 2017 and 2020. After that point, all they did was to try to patch up for the wrongs of 2020. That terrible economic performance was brought about by the biggest government in our history of 125 ministers. That means that you don't need a legion of ministers to be able to manage a country properly. Now, Mr. Speaker, I use myself as an example of the savings that are going to be made by having a reduced government. My colleague on the other side, and my friend, Honorable Oponkuma, who, by the way, is my constituent also, used to head a ministry called the Ministry of Information. Mr. Speaker, that ministry had 76 people working there to manage government information. Mr. Speaker, as I speak to you, it is myself, a deputy, and 5 other people who now manage government information. Mr. Speaker, if you move from 125 ministers to 60 ministers, Mr. Speaker, that means that you are going to buy 60 less Land Cruisers. You are going to buy 60 less saloon cars. You will need to provide 60 less bungalows. You will need to provide 60 less sets of political aides, executive assistants, and what have you. Now, Mr. Speaker, President Mahama has not limited himself to just reducing the numbers of ministers. In any event, as I speak to you, there are only 56 ministers. And in fact, there are 42 ministers running Ghana as we speak because deputy ministers have not been approved. 4 nominees have not been made to make up for the 60. But if you come to the presidential staff, Mr. Speaker, if you take out the civil servants under the office of the president, under the Akufo-Addo administration, there were 337 political appointees under President Akufo-Addo. As I speak to you, Mr. Speaker, there are 26 presidential staffers, people that you can classify as presidential staffers, and then 4 directors. As I speak to you, if you put together the total number of people who work at the presidency where I operate from, they will not amount to 60, Mr. Speaker. Yet they had 337 political appointees. So this is a man who wants to be prudent. And Mr. Speaker, the reason why that is important is that you send a clear signal to the people of Ghana that you are not here to feed facts on their public purse. You are not here to squander their money on the personal comforts of ministers and political appointees. Mr. Speaker, more importantly, Mr. Speaker, President Mahama gave indication, and I've heard them say that he came here to lament and that he didn't provide the way forward. Mr. Speaker, I have a copy of the State of the Nation address.
1 minute left.
President Mahama was very clear. He's a minister.
Mr. Speaker, he has just started.
Mr. Speaker, President Mahama was emphatic in the address that I hold in my hands that he was not here to lament, even though there was much to lament about. Mr. Speaker, how can we not lament a situation where 1.3 million bondholders are denied their bond savings? Mr. Speaker, they say that they left buffers. Mr. Speaker, when we speak about buffers, it simply means one thing: money that you set aside for the specific purpose of paying debts. Mr. Speaker, the account into which monies are paid for the purpose is what you call the debt service reserve account or sinking fund. Mr. Speaker, they claim that, oh, this is not a fund that they were particularly not fond of, and that they didn't use it. This is not true. Mr. Speaker, in previous times, they have made huge transfers into and from this account. There was a time, Mr. Speaker, on 7th October 2024, when they transferred as much as $225 million into this account.
Honorable member, you are time out. You are time out. You are time out. You are timed out. You are timed out.
By the time you came to office,
you are timed out. You are timed out.
In conclusion, Mr. Speaker,
you are timed out.
In conclusion, they left a paltry $64,000 Ghana. Mr. Speaker, we are about to mobilize 15 billion Ghana cedis. So for them to be able to sustain a claim that they left buffers for that purpose, they must show the account into which 15 billion Ghana cedis was held. I thank you very much for the opportunity, Mr. Speaker.